All right, so again, like Ted said, I'm one of the shareholders here, and I head up our real estate practice group, but I have a couple of professionals over here who are every bit as expert as I am. I also do some commercial work, which I am seeing pick up a little bit now, but the story for us in the past year has just been the crazy residential real estate market. We sort of braced for the worst in March of 2020, as I'm sure a lot of you did, because I see a lot of friendly faces that I know are in the real estate world. But by the end of May, things really started amping up, and we really haven't seen it slow down much since, until maybe now we're seeing a little bit of a slowdown. But we normally, I think we do in the range of like 350 closings a year. This year we're already over 500, and we still have a lot more before the end of the year, so it's just been really, really busy. So I wanted to talk to you about why there was such an increase and how it impacted our transactions. Kevin and Chance are going to talk a little bit more about the nitty-gritty of real estate transactions, but I wanted to give you sort of an overview of the past crazy year that we've had. So let's start with market changes. So the pandemic hits, and first, and initially, sellers are rightfully scared to show their properties. So people aren't listing their properties, or they're delisting their properties because of safety concerns. They don't want people walking into their homes. Others, again, who had already listed may have delisted their properties. So there's a shortage in inventory overall. Not to mention, due to stay-at-home orders, buyers weren't getting out. So there was nothing happening, and there was a low demand. And for a couple months, that's just how it was. But where typically a decline in demand leads to lower prices, we didn't see that in the pandemic. We saw the combination of the low supply and low mortgage rates actually allowed the prices to remain steady, at least throughout April and May. The prices of homes then stayed up during the pandemic compared with the prior year, unlike what happened after the 2007 to 2009 crisis. So then, by the summer, when people are starting to figure out how to cope with the pandemic, people are also reconsidering their living situations, obviously. The pandemic changed everything. People were stuck inside. Potential buyers started increasing their housing search and purchase activity by the end of May. Unfortunately, sellers weren't yet keeping up with that, so the supply still stayed short. But because of the interest rates being at all-time lows, buyers still wanted to take advantage, because you never know when those rates are going to go up, and we have seen them sneak up a little bit in just recently. Couple that with people who were forced to spend more time in their homes, especially people in the urban areas. They're cooped up in apartments, they're cooped up in condos, they have children, and they can't get out. So they're needing more space. They want to get out. They no longer are able to take advantage of all the reasons they were in the city to begin with, like entertainment and restaurants, because they're cooped up inside. So now we're seeing people want to move and get more space. So we saw a lot of that. We saw a lot of people moving out to the suburbs. I'm sure there's still lots of single people living in the city who don't need that as much. But we saw a lot of people moving out to the suburbs. We also saw a lot of people moving out of state altogether, but we've seen that for a while just because of the high property tax rates. But the impact on the buyers and sellers to this high demand and low inventory meant that prices started increasing. We already started discussing that. And they started increasing fairly quickly. I mean, I don't trust Redfin necessarily for their values, but I know that my own home in the last year has gone up like 17%, like the value, that their estimated value. So it's going up. Almost every contract though that crossed my desk during the pandemic, up until maybe August of this year, was the result of a bidding war. We saw it all over the place. Or other seller advantageous negotiations. Buyers, almost every single buyer I talked to had a story about how they lost out on a home because there were maybe 11 other offers. Agents, I'm sure you know, found themselves having to put in escalation clauses in their offers. We were hearing about that all the time, which basically means that if another offer came in, they would agree that they would up their offer to a certain number. That it didn't always work, but sometimes it did. I also heard numerous clients say they made offers on homes because they were so worried about the home getting snapped up without even having gone to see the house. People were buying things sight unseen because they were just going off the market so quickly. So properties that would go on the market, they'd have people lining up within hours to see them. Emotions, obviously we talked about, were high on both sides, sellers and buyers. Sellers thought they had the upper hand, and they kind of did. And buyers, we had a lot of first-time home buyers trying to take advantage of the interest rates, and they've got a lot going on. And all of this probably sounds great to sellers, but here's the problem, and we started talking about that a little bit. Unless you have a cash buyer, any buyer getting a loan has to get an appraisal, meaning you need an appraiser. And you need that appraiser to agree that the purchase price is either at or above the value of the property. I'm sorry, you need them to agree that the fair market value is the purchase price. And that means they have to have knowledge of the area, and there have to be comps to support it. And there aren't always the comps, especially in a market where the prices have gone up so quickly. So if the appraiser says the value is not at or above the agreed price, then the buyer has to either come up with the difference between the appraised value and the price, or the seller has to come down. And that's the negotiation. And we saw a lot of that. So what then? Does a buyer even have the money to come up with a difference? Some buyers do, some buyers don't, but there's no sort of mechanism usually in place in contracts where you know if that buyer that you're dealing with is going to be able to come up with a difference. They may say they can, but they may not even know. So to combat these problems, we started seeing agreements come in with actual writers attached to them saying that if the appraisal came in low, then the buyer would agree to cover the spread, maybe up to a certain amount. When I would get involved in those negotiations, I would always talk to the clients and the lender to see what realistically they're able to cover where they would still get their financing. I did see a deal where an appraisal came in, and this was probably like 4 or 5 months into the pandemic, and the appraisal came in $60,000 lower than the agreed purchase price. In that situation, there was no writer or anything like that. The parties, the seller knew this buyer really wanted the property. Buyer, there weren't comps to support it. Buyer had the money, but not all buyers do. The buyer, they bridged the difference and they each split it at $30,000 each. But if there's no appraisal contingency negotiated up front, that's something that we help with during the attorney review process, or try to help with. We always put in our letters when we're negotiating that we want the contract contingent on the appraisal coming in at or above the purchase price. But it's a difficult thing to negotiate right now, and sellers know that they can get the higher price. And practically speaking, if there is a big gap, $10,000 to $20,000, the buyer simply can't cover the spread, then they're likely to get declined their financing anyway. So other things that buyers were doing is just trying to make their offers more appealing. Because of the low inventory, they had to do what they could do to get creative and make themselves appealing to sellers. So I saw a lot of people writing those heartfelt letters. We hear about them all the time, and it's a great way to go. I think it does pull on the heartstrings of some, but every deal is different, every seller is different, every buyer is different, and it may not work. I've also seen in the past year so many as-is contracts, and that's very appealing to a seller, because then that means the buyer can come in and do an inspection, but they can't ask for anything. So the home could be rife with problems, and if they sign an as-is contract, technically they can't ask for anything. They can go in, do their inspection, they can kill the deal if they find out something's really big and there's a real problem, so long as they do it within the first 5 business days. But as is a great thing for sellers, because they're not going to get stuck with giving credits or making any repairs. Even scarier though, I've seen some buyers waive the inspection altogether, which as an attorney I never recommend, even on new construction. You want to do an inspection. That said, if you know, if you're comfortable with the property, if you really feel good about it after having done, maybe you brought an inspector when you did your first viewing of the property, I don't know, then maybe it'll work for you. But you have to be really comfortable that you're not walking into a money pit if you're going to do something like that. Another great option, and I've seen it a few times in the past years, if you have family that has cash and they are willing to give you cash to buy it, and then you can pay them back, you have a personal loan with them, cash offers are the best. Sellers want a cash offer over and over and over again. So that's an option too, if you've got family members who can cover it. So we've seen some of that as well. once we've got a deal in place, we've gone through all the negotiation, and now we got to deal with closings. Closings have changed dramatically, and Denise, I'm sure you've seen it. When you get past all of that, a typical closing, everybody would come. The buyer, the seller, the agent, sometimes the mortgage lenders would actually sit at the closing table together. Obviously, nobody could do that. We're all wearing masks. Title companies have to be safe, so everybody had to pivot and change the way they did things. So it started initially at the beginning of the pandemic, when everybody was really scared. It was buyers only for the most part. Buyers would show up. Attorneys like us would hopefully have reviewed the documents in advance. Often that didn't happen, but sometimes we'd be talking to them on the phone or doing FaceTime or Skype with the buyer at the closing. If it wasn't a financed transaction, nobody would have to attend. You could do it all remotely, which is wonderful. Those are great. But if there's financing involved, lenders still want wet signatures on certain documents, so buyers still had to attend. Next, title companies also started doing curbside closings, which basically means somebody stays in their car, the closer comes out to the car with a package of documents, and they sign it there, and sometimes you're talking to them on the phone while they're sitting in their car signing documents. It worked. I had several people do it, and it worked. Those were people, and this was all before the vaccines were available, so people still weren't comfortable going inside. The goal in every one of these situations was to get documents in advance to review. We as attorneys want to see the deed, we want to see all the seller's documents, we want to see the loan documents too. But lenders obviously have been incredibly slammed. And as I'm sure you all know, closings don't come together till the very last minute. And lenders, because they've had low interest rates, they've got people doing refinances too, so they're incredibly busy. Not to mention we've got staff shortages everywhere. Lenders probably are sitting in their home office trying to do work too. So it was very difficult to get things done in advance. So that meant a whole lot of new hurdles to overcome when you're trying to deal with a closing with your client potentially in a car or sitting by themselves at the title company. But after a few months, I think we all sort of figured it out and got better at it, and it actually sort of became more efficient. Kevin and Chance are pros at doing the remote closing. I wish I was a little bit better at it, but I know they are great. So now, how is this going to affect our closings going forward? Is remote the new normal? Title companies, because the restrictions have lifted a little bit, are letting people come into the closings. I'm seeing agents show up a little bit more. Lenders, I've still not seen come to the closings. But frankly, I think people also are pretty used to not going to closings now. And I think people might not start coming back. I know you're doing yours mostly remote now. And I'm really mostly just seeing buyers and their attorneys. And it's almost more efficient because if you can get those documents in advance and get them reviewed, you can be out of the title company really fast. And that's a much more exciting closing than the normal closing where you sit and you sign and you sign and then you sit some more waiting for the lender to approve finance for funding. So when I'm representing sellers, we always have them pre-sign so that they don't have to attend the closing. Sellers generally don't want to attend closings anyway because they don't want to watch the buyer sign all those documents. So I'm thinking that things are probably changed for good to some degree. I hope so, because I think it's definitely more efficient. I think closings are going smoother after all that craziness and us getting used to it. I think closings are actually going smoother. Will lenders ever allow digital signing? That's what I always get asked. Like, why can't we sign this stuff electronically? I don't know if they're going to get there. There are some lenders who are doing hybrid closings where lots of documents are being signed digitally beforehand, but things like the mortgage and the note, they want wet signatures on them. So typically, you got to go to the closing for that. So how has this changed everything? I mean, communications between the parties has always been vital in every transaction, but even more so now. There's so many moving parts. And so communication is just incredibly important. For instance, with my agents, I want the agents who are representing my clients to get me as much information up front as possible. I want to hear from Dave, how the price was negotiated, how much over the list price it is. If personalities are involved, I want to know the personalities, because a lot of our job is understanding the personalities and sort of managing expectations, not just the legal work, but we're also managing expectations, especially when we've got different personalities involved. Lenders, I also want as much information from them as possible. I want to know if there's any potential credit issues. I want to know if the appraisal comes in low. We kind of talked about this. If the appraisal comes in low, what can the buyer actually cover and still get their financing? Because I don't want my client to agree to something they can't really do. And then clients. I want my clients to talk to me about their concerns. We've seen so many first-time home buyers, and no question is too silly. This is a new process, and especially in this market that we're in, it's crazy. There's a lot to know and there's a lot to understand. I've had a lot of buyers, or had to tell a lot of buyers in this last year, because of this market, there's a lot of things they can't ask for because they're going to risk losing the deal. Because sellers can just say, see you later if they want. I mean, there's really, if they know they've got other buyers lined up, they can be picky. So I don't like doing that, but like I said, communications are vital, and I want my clients to understand and be educated on what all is involved and the risks involved, and that's how I protect them. So, in a nutshell, that was kind of the crazy last year in residential real estate. I think we've learned a lot. I think things are changed for the good in some ways. Hopefully we'll get out of this soon and we won't all have to wear masks at our closings, but for now, we're getting through it. All right, I'm going to turn it over to Kevin.
My name is Kevin Mitrick. I'm a real estate attorney here at Lavelle, and I just wanted to take a little bit of your time today to talk about the importance of attorney review, which right now, as Kelly mentioned, it is just a wild market. So setting expectations, maximizing benefits, and mitigating risks up front is going to put you as a buyer or a seller or your clients into a position where they're going to have better bargaining power, and there's not going to be any confusion. So what I'd like to start out with is just a little bit about what attorney review means. So we start with these template contracts.
Just a little.
Oh, there we go. Makes sense.
There you go.
So we start with template contracts. They're filled in with the particular terms for a transaction, and as much as the folks that drafted these documents want one size that fits all, they don't. It is almost a guarantee that you're going to need to make some sort of change along the way. And there's a lot of different terms in the contract, so there's a lot of different things that you can change. So let's start the discussion about attorney review with what's off limits. And there's really only two items that most folks will agree are off limits, and that's purchase price and broker's compensation. Now with purchase price, the goal is to not start the attorney review process by trying to renegotiate the purchase price. Now there are ways down the line that the purchase price may change. As we talked about earlier, the appraisal comes in low. Sometimes you're going to have to negotiate the price and it'll come down. But the restriction is you don't want to start the conversation with your seller saying, you know, I offered you $350,000 for it, but I'm having a little bit of remorse, so I think I would like to lower the price to $300,000. You can't really do that. But what you can do is change the other terms to create a contract that more accurately reflects your particular transaction. So what you want to do is take a look at the type of property you're purchasing, what you need in order to purchase the property, like financing. And you want to start incorporating new terms, changes to existing terms, or deleting terms that are in the contract to kind of tailor to your specific needs. So we covered importance, scope. Now the timeline for the initial attorney review process, that's going to be about 5 to 7 business days from when you sign the contract. Now, during that 5 to 7 business days, there's two things that happen. Normally, as a buyer, you conduct an inspection, and then your attorney is reviewing all the documents, the contract, taking a look at everything, getting an overview, and coming up with an idea of what needs to happen in order to get this transaction transaction to the finish line. So once the initial 5 to 7 day period is over, normally what happens is the attorney for the buyer sends the seller a letter that outlines all these changes to the contract. And depending on, again, the nature of the transaction, what's involved, the dynamics, could be a very short letter, could be a very long letter. But the goal is to try to put all the terms in a very concise and easy to read letter that the seller's attorney reviews with the seller, and then they respond. And normally what happens is we exchange these letters 2 to 3 times before we get to the point where we've reached an agreement on everything. Or in some cases, we determine we can't reach an agreement, at which point a buyer can terminate the contract and get their earnest money back. Obviously, the goal is not to terminate the contract, because a lot of work has gone into getting us to that point. So the goals of attorney review, as I see them, now other attorneys may think differently, but it's avoiding confusion, mitigating risks, and maximizing the benefit. So starting with avoiding confusion, also managing expectations. At the outset, like I said, you're starting with a template contract, and it identifies key dates. It identifies certain terms. It identifies different contingencies, for lack of a better word. For lack of a better word, contingencies are different benchmarks in the contract. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. But key dates, why is that important? Well, because a contract is a series of dates and deadlines, and a missed deadline or confusion on the deadline can cause avoidable delays, unnecessary termination, and it can create liability for either party. For instance, if a buyer were to have a mortgage contingency and they get to the point where on a particular date their attorney was supposed to request an extension and the attorney doesn't request an extension, well then most sellers will assume that you have fulfilled the requirement of getting a mortgage and you're locked in. But if you haven't received a mortgage yet and it comes to pass that it's denied, well, you're in a little bit of a pickle, because at that point your earnest money could be in jeopardy. You could be in a position where the seller doesn't want to extend the date, and all of a sudden you don't have anything to fall back on. You can't say, well, I have this contingency in place. I don't have the loan, so if you're not going to give me more time, I can cancel the transaction. So identifying those key deadlines is going to be very important. You want to make sure that your attorney is including something in the letter that's outlining, on this day, I will accomplish this, and if I don't accomplish this, I'll request an extension. Or if by this day you don't provide me with this, then I have the ability to either terminate the contract or I have the ability to grant you an extension. Then the next part that you want to think about when you're looking at attorney review are these benchmarks or contingencies. As I mentioned before, there's just a series of deadlines that are included in the contract, and these benchmarks relate to the deadline. So earlier I mentioned there's things that need to happen for your transaction to progress. In order to get to the point where you can close one door and open another door, you need to make sure that you have essentially checked all the boxes on your list. And that's really what attorney review is. You're creating a checklist of items that's going to get you to the goal line. So as far as benchmarks go, there's a lot of things that go into determining what's going to be needed to bring you to the next step. So a lot of it depends on the property type. For instance, if you are purchasing a condominium, well, you're purchasing a unit in a building. There's a lot of other owners. Association is basically a small business. There's money coming in, money going out. You are going to become responsible for common areas. And what you want to do is you want to look and identify what's important to you in terms of purchasing this condominium. For instance, are there projects coming up? If there are projects coming up, does the association have the money to pay for it? If they do have the money to pay for it, are they planning on using that money? Because sometimes associations will have money in their coffers and they'll decide, well, it doesn't really make sense for us to use that money. We'd like to save it. So what we're going to do is add another assessment on the unit owner. So we're going to increase assessments. Now, if you're a first-time buyer and you're purchasing in a condominium, you're usually on a little bit of a budget. So if your assessments are going to go up 2 to 3%, it usually doesn't hurt. But if you've got a roof replacement project that's coming up the pipe, and all of a sudden that assessment is going to go up 15 to 20%, well, at that point, do you really want to progress? So in that example, what we would do is build into the contract the idea that, and a lot of it's already there, but you expand on it. The contract says that there's going to be any indication there's going to be an increase in your holding costs, then you can cancel the contract. Well, everyone has a little bit of a different view about what an increase in holding costs is and what that threshold is. So by creating an idea in the contract during the term of review as to what gets you to that threshold when you can cancel, it helps manage expectations better. For sellers, when I represent sellers and there's a condominium, going back to the condominium example, and I'm sorry I've defaulted to condominiums a lot because it's a lot of what I do. So going back to the example of that increase in assessments, well, as a seller, you obviously want to account for the fact that there are always going to be increases. It's a business. Every year there's going to be a new budget. There's going to be increases in costs. I'd love to tell you that costs are going to go down, but they're usually not. So there's going to be some type of increase every single year. As a seller, you want to factor that in. You want to say, well, if the increase is going to be less than 5%, well, hey, that's just the cost of owning a condo. It's a normal increase. You don't really have the right to cancel. Additionally, going back to the example of the appraisal we talked about earlier, appraisals are big right now. They've become very problematic. So you want to identify early on that you, as a buyer, require this appraisal to happen. You're going to require that it appraised for the purchase price during the mortgage contingency period. And if it doesn't, you have the right to cancel and get your earnest money back. And additionally, creating the benchmarks, as much as the contracts that we have, that I mentioned, are templates, one size fits all, as much as they try to create an even keel for everyone, the end result isn't really as even as it should be. Sometimes you need to create sort of new exits that don't exist in the contract. For instance, there may be something that's important to you as a buyer, or something that's important to a seller that isn't in the contract, and you want to build it in. You definitely don't want to put any red flags in for the other side, but sometimes there's things that are important to you that need to happen, and those need to be incorporated into the contract. If they're not incorporated into the contract and that thing doesn't happen, well, then you really don't have any avenue to get out of the contract. During the pandemic, the big new term that came into the contract was a COVID-related clause, and it said that if anyone were to come down with COVID and they couldn't get to the closing, or they were sick and weren't allowed to go to the closing and they couldn't have a power of attorney, well, they shouldn't be held in default, which, I mean, realistically, that's a very reasonable term, right? But sellers really didn't want to go for that, because in sellers' minds, okay, you buyer, you may not be able to go to the closing. However, you could probably have someone signed by power of attorney. If you have somebody signed by power of attorney, why can't the closing happen? So power of attorney was able to help us quite a bit, but in the beginning of the pandemic, we didn't know whether title companies were going to be open or not, just because the rules were changing, requirements were changing. What was open one day wasn't open the next day. So as attorneys, we had to figure out a way to incorporate into these letters an out. And ultimately what happened, and still I see them quite a bit today, not as much as before, but it was basically if there is a shutdown, a lender, the title company, or a buyer can't attend, or a seller can't attend, we're going to extend to the next business, the next day that everyone can actually get there, or a representative for them can get there. That was one of the benchmarks that came up during the pandemic. So essentially, these benchmarks are creating either forward progress or the ability to terminate the contract. And as a buyer, you never really want to have a situation come up where you need to terminate the contract, especially right now, because getting under contract is such a big deal because of the lack of inventory. But every once in a while, you do need to get out of the contract, and you want to have these benchmarks in place. Or the benchmarks, again, it's just those checks that you have to put in the boxes to get to the point where you're at that goal line, and you can finally move forward. And goal line obviously being the closing. So your key dates, managing them, hitting them, and then hitting all your benchmarks or the contingencies, that's what's going to get you to the point that you can actually close on the transaction. Now, mitigating risk. part of the attorney approval process is taking into consideration what happens during the inspections. So initially, the buyer will have an inspection of the property, and normally that's the only inspection that happens. However, there are certain things that could come up that require additional due diligence. Well, if that happens, normally by the time you're ready to put your attorney review letter out, you know that some additional due diligence is going to be needed, or that more time is needed to complete the initial inspection. And that was a big thing during the pandemic. We didn't have enough inspectors to go out and take a look. So that pushed the process down the road, and we had to do quite a bit of extensions. But during attorney review, what you want to do is take a look at these inspections with your buyers and determine, well, is this property in a condition that you find acceptable? Do you want to move forward? Because of the lack of inventory right now, getting a seller in a very hot area to agree to do anything at all is like pulling teeth. It just doesn't happen. Sellers are of the opinion the grass is always greener on the other side, and there is grass on the other side, meaning there are backup offers. Even if I don't have them right now, my realtor can go out and find them. Because I have a commodity that everyone wants, and there's not enough of them, which is a house in a particular area that's very desirable. So the role of inspections became even more important because it really wasn't a situation where we could ask for sellers to provide us with anything. So we really dug in. We started to look at the entire property. And during the pandemic, I started to see a lot more additional due diligence. I started to see a lot more sort of specialized inspections, and including a lot of structural issues. After the issues with the condo collapse in Florida, we had a lot of folks, I did, that wanted to take a look at the structure of a condo. So I actually had some people pay quite a bit of money to have someone come in and take a look at the foundation of condo buildings, which I had never seen before, but sort of just the evolution of the attorney review and inspection periods. So inspections are key. You want to build into your attorney review process the idea that the inspections are needed. You want to use attorney review to address any inspection concerns that came up, and also buy yourself more time if you need additional time. Then, mitigating risk includes document review. In connection with these closings, the volume of paperwork that comes across your desk, well, now comes through email, is astronomical. There is about 20 to 30 pages for every aspect of your transaction. Now, defaulting back to the condos, again, that's what I do most of. During condo review, or during attorney review, I set the tone for what I expect for the seller of the association to provide. Now, the Condominium Property Act in Illinois has a list of items that need to be provided. However, that list, while it's intended to provide you with all the information that you need about a condo, it rarely does. So I use the attorney review process to incorporate additional requests for more information that we don't necessarily get right from the Condo Property Act. And in connection with asking for those additional documents and information, we want to build in an out, saying, if this information isn't acceptable to me, well, then I want to take that information and I want to be able to terminate the contract. Additionally, as far as document review goes, there could be additional information related to a particular property that you want to take a look at. Big thing when it comes to prior work on a home, is it under warranty? Is there a roof that's new? Is it under warranty? If it is, can I see the warranty paperwork? And I make sure that this is going to be transferable to me. And that's something that you really want to look at early on, so you're not at a closing table asking, well, where's the paperwork for the roof warranty that it's supposed to transfer over to me? And all of a sudden you realize it doesn't automatically transfer because there's a fee that has to be paid and an inspection needs to be done. So you want to take the opportunity up front to identify what the potential risks could be with this particular condition, and then you want to make sure that you build something into the contract so that if it comes to pass that your particular concern is valid, after reviewing the information, you can back out and get your earnest money back. Now, the next part about mitigating risk is title. So, as a buyer, you should expect your seller to give you good and merchantable title. As a seller, you should expect to pay for an owner's title insurance premium. And you should expect to provide title companies with documentations that need to clear title. Now, title issues, incredibly rare. And I think that the claim rate is about 1 to 2%. So nothing that anyone expects. But when a claim does come through, and it's a title claim, they get really messy. They get really costly. And you don't really ever want to have to make a title claim. So what you should do, and what I like to do in my attorney review process, is I build in what I expect from title. Number one, we default to the contract. We want good and merciful title. We want no issues. Essentially, we'd love it if the only thing that title says that we always have to pay our taxes and we have to pay our mortgage if there's a mortgage. But there's always going to be more than that. So what the attorney does is when this title information comes in, you want to go through it and you want to make sure that what your client is getting is something that's not going to cause them problems and it isn't going to be a problem for them to sell later on. Because most folks aren't buying properties to hold for a lifetime. And if they find out 20 years after they purchased a property, when they go to sell it, there's something that existed prior to when they purchased that they could have cleared, what do you think they're going to call first? They're going to call the attorney. Why didn't you catch this? So title acts as, well, the title commitment acts as a checklist. You want to go through that with a fine-tooth comb. If there is a question, you want your attorney to ask about it. You want your attorney to find out, is this going to impact my ownership interest down the road? And if it is, what can the title company or the seller do for me now to get rid of that risk or mitigate it as much as possible? So talk about mitigating risk. Next part of the attorney review process, maximizing benefits. That's why you hire us. We want to make sure that we are worth our rate. So what we're going to do is try to find different ways within the terms of the contract to make sure that the deal that you're getting is the best that you can possibly get for you. Creating opportunities. Template contracts, pretty vanilla. Not a whole lot that pops off the page and says, oh, well, this is wonderful, this is great for me. So you have to find ways to maximize the benefits. And creating opportunities, the best example I can use here is for a seller. So earlier today, and sorry, I'm sorry, I forgot your name, we were talking about appraisal issues. So we get the bidding wars. Bidding wars happen all the time. So let's say that your place is priced at $300,000 and you accept an offer for $320,000. In your mind as a seller, you're assuming that your buyer has that extra cash, that they have the extra $20,000. But that isn't necessarily something that you can confirm, or you should just, it's not something you should just assume. So you want to investigate it. You want to find out, you want to ask, do you have this extra money? When it comes to appraisal contingencies, most buyers are going to ask for it. You want to respond accordingly. If you have a property you listed for $300,000, someone's paying $320,000 for it, and now they're coming in and they're saying to you, I want to back out of this contract if it's not worth $320,000. Well, that's not fair to you as a seller, because you may have turned down somebody that has cash that was willing to pay $5 over. And if it comes in at $300,000, well, then all of a sudden, you're back to square one, plus you've foregone the other offer that was cash that you could have gotten $5,000 extra for. So what you want to do, and what I've been doing with my sellers, is we build in thresholds. We say, all we're going to do is agree that this property has to appraise for $300,000. If it appraises for $300,000, we're going to consider this completely done. The appraisal contingency is satisfied, and we're going to assume that you have the cash to come to closing with the additional amount. If you don't, then the buyer's in risk of default because you build it in that way, so they can't just back out later on. So initially, during not necessarily the pandemic, but when the prices started to go up, which was right around when the pandemic started, buyers were pushing back on it. But as inventory decreased and the number of multiple offers increased, now buyers are on board. They understand, I'm not just going to be able to talk my way into this property and then later on talk myself back to the price that I want to pay. I have to have the money to come up with up front. That's an idea, an example of maximizing the benefits for your client. Monetary incentives. Well, as a buyer, you want to find extra value wherever you can. And best example of this would be taxes, tax credits. Most of the time when you have a transaction in Illinois, you're going to receive a tax credit. Taxes are billed in arrears. So the tax credit is sort of a unique beast because most of the time it's just an educated guess. You can't go back on later on. You need to make sure that when you're setting the expectations and creating your attorney review letter, that you're factoring in that tax credit, that you're making sure that it's as high as it can be if you're the buyer. If you're a seller, you want to go as low as possible. You want to use the most recent information that you can find that's going to identify a low percentage for a tax credit. Now, additionally, going back to the idea of the inspection, there could be issues that come up. As a seller, you don't want to do any work. You want to basically pay a buyer to just take the property if you're willing to do anything at all. You want to provide a credit that's fair, that's not going to put you in the poorhouse, that's going to appease the buyer, and it's going to avoid any type of work. As a buyer, you also want the seller to provide you the credit, because most of the time you don't want someone that's going to leave a home to pay for repairs. Because let's be honest, someone that's leaving isn't necessarily going to go out and find the most expensive or sometimes the most competent person. It's just what's going to get me out the door, and it's the bare minimum for your seller. So that's why both parties generally like credits. It's going to give you a position where you're going to get what you need to do the work later on, or as a seller, you're going to provide what the buyer needs to do the work later on without selling yourself short, as a buyer or a seller. Now, additionally, and this is sort of new, not new, but newer, is we now have the ability to anticipate future trends and changes. And that is just huge for the attorney review process, or real estate transactions as a whole, really. There is more data available now than there's ever been before, and that data can paint a picture for you of the property you're buying that you can't get from paper, you can't get from inspection. So going back to the tax example, when you're creating a tax credit request in a letter, you're going to look at the prior year's taxes. That's usually how folks do it. It's usually 5 to 10% over what the prior year's taxes are. But there's so much more to property taxes in Illinois, because as most of you know, if you're Cook County, every 3 years we have a triennial reassessment. So what I like to do is I like to go onto the county websites and look to see if new information is out relative to the assessed value, which is the basis for tax calculations. If you can find new information that indicates there's going to be an increase in taxes over and above the 5 to 10% that we normally build in, well, why not use that? Why not point to that piece of information as a justification to go higher? So what I've been doing, especially right now with properties in the city of Chicago, is I am building in specific requests. I'm taking last year's tax calculation, taking out last year's tax value, and putting in the 2021 value. And that helps to create a more realistic number that the buyer's going to benefit from. Additionally, going back to the data comment, you can find more information about a property now than ever before. You can go online and you can find out any violation that's occurred from many municipalities. So you can get information about your property from 2-3 owners ago. You know, I often run in, I'm going to go back to the roof example, because I've been arguing about roofs now for same transaction for about 4 or 5 days. And it goes back to the same thing. How old is the roof? Is it under warranty? The seller says, well, I didn't do the roof. The person that I purchased from says it's 8 years old, so I'm going to say it's 8 years old. Well, in the past, you didn't really have anything that you could go off. You couldn't find out, well, is the roof really 8 years old? But now, with a few clicks of the mouse, you can find out exactly how old the roof is, because you can pull permit information. A lot of places require you to pull a permit to do a roof. So in that instance, I was able to find out how old the roof was, 15 years old, not 8. But it's just using data that's available helps you identify where you're at, what you need to do for your client, and it helps you anticipate future trends. And trends, it's really benefiting your client to build in what's almost a living contract that is going to reflect something that happens down the road. And I've had clients that have called me after closings 2 or 3 years later, and they say, thank you very much for this, because what you were able to do was help us avoid this problem that our neighbors in the townhouse next door, they're going through right now. But because we were able to look at it, we were able to analyze it, and we were able to ask for that information early, we were able to avoid that situation. And I think that's a trend that's going to be continuing, is we're going to be able to access more information, and we're not going to have to rely so much on property inspections. Inspections are great, but they don't tell the whole story. But there is enough data that's being collected, that is being put together in a place that you can go and find it. You can find out information about a property now that you couldn't before. And even if the data is not available online, FOIA requests are amazing. It may take a little bit of time, but you can ask most government entities to provide information on a particular property. As long as it's not private information, they're going to share it with you for the public good. Now, if you're submitting requests to the city of Chicago, it might take a little bit of time, but even the city will get back to you. I've used FOIA requests with the city quite extensively. I use FOIA requests in the suburbs as well. It's just using the information that's available to you from public and private sources to put your client in the best position. So that's the attorney review process. So thank you very much.
We'll trim this down a little to hit the key points here. Good morning, everybody. I'm Chance Badger, also a real estate attorney here at Lavelle Law. I work a lot with property investors, so I'm going to focus on some key areas there. Several types of property investments. We're going to touch on just a few here. Number one, my least favorite, is just rentals. Passive income coming in, either buy a single-family home, multi-unit, rent it out to your tenants. It's great to have that passive income, but with that can come a lot of headaches of being a landlord. It's never as simple as just collecting a check every month. There are going to be problems, especially unexpected ones. My favorite type of investments are flips. Let's buy a place that's undervalued. Let's throw some money into it, put it back on the market. Everybody gets a great profit. Finally, I'm going to talk about qualified opportunity zones. This is an opportunity that's come up since 2018 that allows you to invest in a property in a distressed area and potentially collect some profits and save on your taxes because of where you invested. So qualified opportunity zones, they're going to be designated by the states, but they do need to be certified by the U.S. Secretary of the Treasury. You're going to defer your your profit from a separate sale into a specifically designated entity that is set up specifically to invest in a qualified opportunity zone. This is called a qualified opportunity fund. If you hold this investment for at least 5 years, there's going to be a 10% discount on your capital gains tax. That increases to 15% if you hold it for up to 7 years. And if you hold it for 10 years, you get rid of all your capital gains tax. If anybody knows what a 1031 exchange is, where an exchange of property for like kind, just like that, there's going to be a timeline here of 180 days. So you have 180 days from the first sale to set up your own entity, take those qualified opportunity funds, and invest them into a qualified opportunity zone. I'll talk about a little bit on LLCs because it is very, very important that you mitigate your personal liability when you are investing in real estate. You do not want to just be a sole proprietor. If something goes wrong, you're the one that's liable, not just for your original investments, but possibly much more on top of that. An LLC is going to protect you. An LLC owner, if you do everything correctly, can only be liable up to their financial contribution into that LLC. If you're going to be owning a lot of properties, Illinois has a fantastic program called Series LLC. Basically, you can run your entire business under one operating agreement, and you can create a separate series under your main LLC to hold the property. Each series LLC is considered separate from the other, so if something goes wrong in property one, whoever's suing you cannot go after property two. LLCs also are going to allow you to avoid double taxation. If money's coming in, it's only going to get taxed once. So your LLC is not going to get taxed, and then you're not going to get taxed. It's just going to be one time. LLCs can also provide you some flexibility in sharing the profits. If you got some business partners, everybody's in the same LLC, let's say everybody's a 50-50 owner, you don't necessarily need to divvy up your profits that way. If somebody's putting in more time, they're doing in the legwork, they're finding these properties, and they need to get paid a little more to compensate, LLC allows you to do that easily. Unlike a partnership, where everything has to be split according to the percentage ownership. 1031 exchanges. Before qualified opportunity zones were a thing, 1031 exchanges were a great way to avoid capital gains taxes. It used to be you could exchange one type of property or asset for a like-kind asset, like with stocks, private jets, classic cars, anything like that. That has recently changed to only being available for real estate transactions. What is a like-kind property? When it comes to real estate, it's incredibly broad. You could basically make the argument that any type of property is a like-kind property. You might have to get a little creative with it, but that's never been a problem. 1031 exchanges do have a timeline. Once you sell your first property, all of those proceeds go into a holding company. You cannot receive those proceeds directly. So they're going to be held by this holding company, and you have 45 days to then identify your new property. Once you've identified that property, you've got 180 days to actually complete the sale. The holding company will then release the funds, and that investment goes into the new property, and you do not have to pay any taxes yet. Ultimately, you can do unlimited 1031 exchanges. You can keep rolling over your profits into a new property and keep that building, and then when you finally sell, you're only going to pay capital gains on that last profit. If you originally invest $500,000, keep rolling it over, you sell a property for 1.5, you're not paying on $1 million of property of taxes. It'll just be that last transaction. So if you bought that last property for 1.2, sell it for 1.5, you're only paying capital gains on 300,000. Many different ways to finance your real estate investments. Everybody knows what a conventional loan is. You find a mortgage broker, submit your credit application. Depending on what you qualify for, your down payment can go anywhere between 5 to 20%, and your interest rate is going to all depend on your credit. But there are some creative ways to finance your real estate investments. Number one, FHA. If you've been in real estate for a while, you're probably saying, chance, you can use FHA for your primary residence. How are you going to use that for a real estate investment? There are a couple ways around it. Number one, you only need to use this property, if it's a single family home, you only need to use it as your primary residence for a year. After that, you can refinance and you can turn this into an investment. Or number two, you can buy a multi-unit, live in one of those units, charge everybody else rent. If you set this up correctly, you could be living there for free. And finally, we're going to talk about hard money loans. People usually refer to these as a bridge loan or a last resort. But if used correctly, they can be a very, very valuable way to finance your real estate investments. You don't need assets it's not dependent on your credit in order to get a hard money loan. They are going to be giving you a loan based directly on the collateral. So if you're investing in real estate property, the lender is going to base the amount that they're lending to you based on that collateral. These can also be very beneficial for lenders. Hard money loans are usually a very short timeline, anywhere between a year to 3 years. You're not going to be able to pay back what you owe. Lender takes over the property. Either way, they're sitting better than they were at the beginning. Hard money loans are fantastic for property flippers. You get a good boost of money there to complete your repairs. If you get everything done within a year, put it back on the market, you turn a profit, pay your lender back, no harm doing. And I think I finished up just at 9. So we got some time for questions.
Yeah. Right. I'm in the process of closing a property. The tenant is inside not paying rent. So seller is giving me $1,500 to evict the tenant, but instead I turn around and say, you give this $1,500 to the tenant for her to leave.
Mm-hmm.
So we are in the process of doing this. I wanted to know what other options that I have. Because I can close right now, but then I don't want to close having her inside.
Sure. When does the lease expire?
The lease?
Yeah.
She has no lease. She's not paying rent.
Good. So no lease.
Month.
All right. So I mean, you get 2 reasons to evict there. You can have them give a 30-day notice to the tenant. Like that, they're gonna have to leave at the beginning of the next month. Or number two, if they're not paying, eviction courts are back open, so you can start the eviction process. It's time consuming and expensive, but those are your two options. Or you can give them that cash for keys, if you give the tenant that money to say, get out, have them, oh, sorry, go ahead.
So if you're well past, the attorney review and inspection period where you would negotiate these things, I mean, you can still say, I'm not gonna close until the person's out. I mean, you just make it contingent on them being out.
Well, this is what we are at right now, but she has no intention to leave. This is a problem. So my attorney say, if she's not leaving until 1st of December, we have to cancel. But I don't want to cancel. I don't want to
Next,
cancel.
there'll be a moratorium on evictions soon. 'Cause they
Yeah, the
starts,
winter.
the winter, they stop doing evictions, so you'll have that, you'll run into that as well.
Yeah, I would direct to cancel because of it. It's gonna be a lot harder to sell this property in December than it is right now. So I would have your attorney go back to the seller and say, you need to up your offer, you gotta get this person out.
Sorry, I don't understand. What did you say?
Have the seller up their offer more than $1,500 to the tenant, give them a little more money to see if that moves them. And if they're not gonna move, then you might just have to let this one go.
Oh. So how long does the eviction take?
I mean, it depends on what sort of tenant it is. I mean, they can drag it out. I used to do eviction work, and I mean, usually landlords trying to negotiate some sort of agreement with them to give them a little bit of time to get out, but have something enforceable if they don't. But if they know how to drag it out, and there's lots of tenant attorneys out there that will do it, they could drag it out for months. And like I said, there's a moratorium. I don't know where the property is, but is it all over Illinois where there's a moratorium on evictions?
Specifically Chicago.
Yeah, I mean, at least in Chicago, there's a moratorium where they won't do evictions during winter months. So even if you got a judgment saying that they got an eviction order, you'd have to wait until probably February is maybe when they start back up. Yeah. Sorry. It's not great news. Yeah, go ahead.
One question, what do you look for when there is a cash sale? And do you look for proof of funds?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. Because I'm on the lending side, where transactions have fallen apart, so someone didn't ask for proof of funds, because all of a sudden, the house was back on the market, and so whose responsibility is that during the transaction on the buy or sell side?
Most of the time, I see agents get that up front before they'll even have their clients sign off on an offer. But I always ask for that. If I haven't seen it, when I get a contract come across my table that's cash, I'll say, have we seen proof of funds? And if we haven't, then I put that in my attorney review letter saying, we want to see this by such and such date, or,
Yeah, I often kind of wonder how some of it falls through the cracks. Most of it doesn't, but
Yeah.
I got one where,
They can. Anything else?
I would think that's the responsibility of the broker, the agent,
the real estate.
for sure.
Okay.
We just had a cash offer on a Northbrook home over the weekend, and we didn't even present it to our seller until we had that document.
Yeah.
And we got the document within 24 hours, which then you know it's legit.
Yeah.
You don't really know it's legit until you call, but if they're turning over the documentation right away,
Yeah.
they're
That's
serious about it.
Okay.
So I always take it on my responsibility, like,
I mean, that's preferable because that way you don't get too far into the process.
well, sure.
As far as 1031 exchanges, I didn't realize that at the end, where you only pay capital gains on that last property. And
Yeah,
it
you
doesn't
get-
go back to the.
Right, you gotta step
basis.
up in basis.
Wow, that's great. That was a huge.
Anything else?
I wanted to say that anytime I've worked with anybody from Lavelle Law, and this is not a plug, this is just to say, like, it's super important to have a team with you that knows what they're doing. Because when you don't have that, it just causes problems from the beginning. If you have a good inspector, if you have a good attorney, you don't have to be thinking about it. If you have a lender that stays on top of things, you have a transaction coordinator, it's like y'all work as a team. And you're only as good as your weakest link. And like, I appreciate even what you said to the buyer over there. To me, that's a red flag.
Yeah.
If I was her attorney, I would say, get out now and go do something else. Because by the time the eviction happens, you spent so much money, you wasted your time, and now it's summer next year, and you're still wondering what you're doing. Like, that's not getting good advice, right? Bad news up front. So I appreciate how you guys are showing up, and any transactions I've done with you have been really smooth. And I think that's the most important thing, and it costs money. You see these cards that come in the mail for attorneys for $300. Oh yeah, you got a great deal, until attorney review and something got lost and nobody's following up, and it's not a great deal. I mean, you're trying to save $300?
Exactly.
Like, the emails going
It's
back
like the
and
biggest
forth.
transaction of your life.
Makes no sense. Makes no sense. And in fact, I had an attorney recently, he just upped his fee to $750. My answer to him, he goes, make sure you tell clients, my answer to him was, it's still a deal for $750. Like, you gotta work with the right people.
Yeah, and also, I mean, there's lots of, attorneys who dabble in real estate. You don't want those if you have like family friend who's an attorney.
Oh, yeah. But
And they
the
say
family
they can
friends.
do real estate.
Yeah.
It's not a good idea. Because
Yeah,
they're gonna spend a lot of time just learning and they're gonna miss stuff, so.
yeah, good point.
Or they're used to a different pace.
Yeah, they're used to a different pace, exactly.
Can't find them.
Well, thank you everyone for
guys.
coming out and, we have cards up here if anybody wants to take one, but we are always available if we can be a resource.